The moment my own brother looked across the executive conference table and said, "Security can escort her out now," I realized this had never been an ordinary disagreement. Why had my termination papers been prepared before the board even finished voting? Why did he panic when a confidential board folder landed in my hands by mistake? And why did an anonymous email arrive before I had even driven out of the parking lot? As I stepped into the elevator carrying that folder, I had no idea page 19 contained the first piece of evidence that my firing wasn't just about my job. It was about something someone inside my family's company desperately needed to hide. If you're watching from outside the United States, I'd genuinely love to know where you're joining from. Tell me your country and what time it is where you are right now. I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family trust justice and standing up for yourself, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next chapter. The company my father built never felt like a business to me when I was growing up. It felt like another member of the family. Gonzalez Industrial Systems started in a rented warehouse on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, nearly 35 years before my brother fired me. My father, Richard Gonzalez, had begun with 4 employees, 2 aging milling machines, and a promise that if he ever became successful, he would treat every employee the way he wished someone had treated him when he was young. By the time I graduated from Ohio State University with a degree in industrial engineering, that little warehouse had grown into 3 manufacturing facilities, supplying precision components for medical equipment energy companies and transportation manufacturers throughout the Midwest. People often assumed Adrian was destined to inherit the company simply because he was the oldest. They weren't entirely wrong. He had charisma. Investors liked him. Customers remembered him. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new business opportunities before lunch. I was different. I preferred spreadsheets to speeches, factory floors instead of banquet halls, processes instead of presentations. When production lines broke down, people called me. When suppliers missed deliveries, they called me. When a snowstorm shut down transportation across 3 states during the pandemic, I spent 48 straight hours reorganizing production schedules and alternate shipping routes. We fulfilled 96% of our customer contracts, while several competitors failed to meet even half of theirs. That achievement earned me the position of Chief Operating Officer. Not because I was Richard Gonzalez's daughter, because every department already depended on me. For years, Adrian and I complemented each other surprisingly well. He found opportunities. I made sure we could actually deliver them. He dreamed big. I built the systems that turned those dreams into reality. Our father often joked that Adrian was the engine while I was the steering wheel. Neither worked particularly well without the other. At least that's what I believed. Everything began changing about 8 months before I lost my job. Adrian announced during a leadership retreat that he wanted Gonzalez Industrial Systems to acquire another manufacturing company based in Indiana. It was called Mercer Precision Components. The acquisition price was enormous, nearly $240 million. The opportunity looked exciting on the surface. Mercer had several valuable government contracts and modern equipment. Investors loved the announcement. Local newspapers praised Adrian as an ambitious second-generation CEO willing to transform the company into a national manufacturer. But the excitement faded the moment I started reviewing the numbers. Mercer's financial statements looked unusually polished. Too polished. Their reported maintenance expenses had dropped almost 40% over 2 years, despite aging equipment. Warranty claims had mysteriously improved during periods when production volume increased. Inventory values seemed consistently optimistic. None of those issues alone proved fraud. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. During one executive meeting, I placed several reports onto the conference table. I think we should delay this acquisition until an independent operational audit is complete. The room became unusually quiet. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "You're being overly cautious again." "I'm being responsible." "Our competitors aren't waiting. Our competitors also aren't spending $240 million. Several vice presidents exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one interrupted. Adrian folded his hands. "If we hesitate every time we see risk, we'll never grow," I answered calmly. "If we ignore risk because growth sounds exciting, eventually we stop existing." That meeting ended without a decision. Or so I thought. Over the following weeks, something subtle changed. Meetings I normally attended suddenly appeared on calendars after they had already happened. Presentation files reached me hours later than everyone else. Finance reports arrived with missing appendices. When I asked questions, I received vague answers. "Adrian already handled that. It wasn't really operations. We'll fill you in later." At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. Stress makes intelligent people question themselves. I knew that. So instead of confronting anyone, I started documenting everything. Not because I suspected a conspiracy, because documentation had always been my habit. Every meeting invitation, every revised report, every delayed email, every version of every presentation. Years working in operations teaches one simple lesson: memory is useful, records are better. About 3 weeks before I was fired, Noah Brooks knocked quietly on my office door. Our chief financial officer rarely looked nervous. That afternoon he did. He closed the door before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated. "Have you been receiving the same board materials everyone else receives?" I frowned. "As far as I know." He looked relieved and worried at the same time. "Never mind. Noah." He forced a smile. "I probably misunderstood something." Then he left. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it stayed with me. Noah wasn't the type to ask careless questions. A few days later, Melissa Turner from Human Resources stopped by my office carrying hiring documents. She lingered longer than necessary. "You've been working late?" "So has everyone." She nodded but didn't leave. Finally, she asked quietly, "Are you backing up your personal files?" The question caught me off guard. "My personal files?" "The ones you created yourself." "I always do." She gave the slightest nod. "Good." Then she walked away. At the time, I assumed she was reminding me about cybersecurity. Now I understood she had been trying to warn me without saying anything directly. 3 days before I lost my job, Adrian invited several executives to dinner with potential investors. For the first time in 12 years, I wasn't invited. When I asked his assistant whether my calendar invitation had been missed, she looked genuinely confused. "I thought Adrian told you." "Told me what?" "He said operations didn't need to attend." Operations? The department responsible for integrating any future acquisition. The department I led. That was the first moment I stopped believing these incidents were random. Still, I didn't accuse anyone. I simply continued saving documents, printing reports, keeping notes, watching. Then came Monday morning. The termination meeting, the humiliation, the security escort, the confidential board folder accidentally placed among my own documents. After sitting in my driveway for almost 20 minutes, I finally carried everything inside my house. The folder felt heavier than ordinary paper should. I made coffee I never drank. My hands weren't shaking from anger anymore. They were shaking because I couldn't stop thinking about Adrian's expression. He hadn't looked relieved after firing me. He had looked frightened. That wasn't the face of someone celebrating victory. It was the face of someone hoping a mistake hadn't just happened. I placed the folder on my dining table. The cover page read, "Board of Directors Confidential Final Meeting Materials." I carefully opened it. Inside were financial summaries, legal memoranda, agenda pages, voting resolutions. Everything looked ordinary, until I noticed something strange. The page numbers skipped. Page 17, page 18, then directly to page 20. Someone had removed page 19. My heartbeat quickened. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated. A new email had arrived from an address I had never seen before. There was no greeting, no signature, just one sentence. Compare the digital copy with the printed one before anyone realizes which version you have. I read the anonymous email 3 times before I allowed myself to react. There was no signature, no hidden image, no attachment, just one sentence. Compare the digital copy with the printed one before anyone realizes which version you have. I looked back at the folder lying open on my dining room table. Someone clearly believed I possessed something I wasn't supposed to have. But what I refused to jump to conclusions. That habit had saved me countless times during my career. People often confuse suspicion with proof. They're not the same thing. I carried the folder into my home office, locked the door, and powered up the laptop I owned personally. I had always kept my work and personal devices separate. It wasn't because I distrusted anyone. It was simply good practice. As COO, I routinely archived meeting agendas, board packets, and operational reports after every major board meeting. Many of those files had been emailed to me over the years before the company switched to its secure board portal. I searched through my personal archive. Within 15 minutes, I located a digital copy of the board packet that had been distributed 4 days before my termination. The file names looked almost identical. Boardpacketfinal.pdf. The printed folder in front of me carried the same title. I opened the digital version beside the printed documents. At first glance, they matched perfectly. Same cover page, same agenda, same financial summaries, same voting schedule. I almost convinced myself the anonymous sender had made a mistake. Then I slowed down. Operations had taught me something important. Major fraud rarely hides in obvious places. It hides in ordinary details people stop noticing. I compared page numbers. The digital file contained 23 pages. The printed packet contained 22. Page 19 existed in the digital copy. It did not exist in the printed version. My pulse quickened. I opened the digital page. The heading read, Supplemental Risk Assessment, Mercer Precision Components Acquisition. I remembered writing that report. Every word. It summarized the operational due diligence my department had completed after 6 weeks of inspections. The conclusion had been simple. Delay the acquisition until additional verification could be completed. The report listed concerns about deferred equipment maintenance, unrealistic production forecasts, inconsistent inventory valuation, and unresolved warranty liabilities. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts supported by inspection records. I reached for the printed folder again. The pages jumped directly from 18 to 20. Someone hadn't forgotten to print page 19. Someone had deliberately removed it. I leaned back in my chair. If board members had received the printed packet, they never saw my recommendation. If they never saw my recommendation, they voted without critical information. That alone didn't explain my firing, but it explained why someone wanted page 19 gone. I continued comparing the remaining pages. Another difference appeared. The voting resolution approving negotiations for the acquisition included an electronic signature from me. I stared at it. My name, my title, my approval. Everything looked authentic, except I had never signed it. For several seconds, I simply looked at the screen. Then I enlarged the signature. It was my corporate electronic signature, not a scanned image. The actual encrypted company signature used inside our document management system. Only a handful of people had administrative authority over those approvals. I wasn't one of them, which meant someone with elevated access had applied my signature without my authorization. That crossed far beyond office politics. I immediately stopped touching the files. Instead, I photographed every page with my phone. I recorded timestamps. I saved duplicate copies onto 2 encrypted drives. Then I printed screenshots showing the page differences. Years earlier, one of our outside auditors had told our executive team something I never forgot. If you believe evidence may disappear, preserve it before asking questions. I finally understood what he meant. The next morning, I called Rachel Kim. Our general counsel answered after the second ring. "Mackenzie, you sound surprised." "I heard what happened yesterday." "So did everyone else." There was a long silence. Finally, she asked quietly, "Are you calling as my friend or as the company's former COO?" "I honestly don't know." She sighed. "Then meet me somewhere that isn't the office." An hour later, we sat in a quiet coffee shop several miles away from headquarters. Rachel never touched her coffee. She looked exhausted. "I can't represent you personally," she began. "I know. But I can explain corporate procedures. That's all I need." I slid copies of the 2 packets across the table. She examined them carefully. The moment she noticed the missing page, her expression changed. "Where did you get this printed version? It came home with me by accident." "And no one has contacted you asking for it back?" "Not yet." Rachel compared the 2 documents again. "This is unusual." "Unusual?" She looked directly into my eye. "Mackenzie directors are entitled to receive complete meeting materials before voting." "I know. If a material report was intentionally withheld, the validity of that vote could become a serious legal issue." She wasn't exaggerating. Corporate boards depend on informed decision-making. If essential information is removed before directors vote, the board may have acted based on incomplete facts. I pointed at my electronic signature. "I didn't authorize this." Rachel studied it for nearly a minute. "I believe you. Can you prove it?" "I can't." "Who can?" "The IT audit logs." "Are those permanent?" "They should be." "Should?" She hesitated. "They're only useful if nobody altered them." That answer stayed with me. If someone had enough access to apply my signature, they might also have access to modify system records. Rachel lowered her voice. "Mackenzie." "What?" "If I were you, I wouldn't accuse anyone yet. I'm not planning to." "Good." "Why?" "Because the moment someone realizes you noticed this, they'll start protecting themselves." Exactly what I had been thinking. I left the cafe more convinced than ever that patience mattered more than outrage. When I arrived home, another surprise was waiting. Noah Brooks was standing beside my front porch. He looked over both shoulders before I even reached him. "I wasn't sure you'd answer your phone." "You could have called." "I didn't want this conversation on company records." He held a plain manila envelope. "I shouldn't even be here." "Then why are you—" He handed it to me. "I've been trying to figure something out since last week." Inside were printed system reports, login histories, file access records, document revision summaries. Noah spoke quietly. "I can't access everything, but I can see enough to know somebody modified board documents after finance submitted the final package." I turned another page. Every revision included timestamps accurate to the second. One entry immediately caught my attention. The supplemental risk report had been removed less than 3 hours before the board meeting. Not days, not weeks, hours. Noah pointed to another line. "Look at the user account." I expected to see Adrian's executive credentials. Instead, the report listed a different account. Board admin 0EO7. I frowned. Whose account is this? Noah shook his head. That's the problem. It doesn't belong to any executive. Then who controls it? He looked genuinely unsettled. I've worked here 11 years. I've never seen that account before. We both stared at the page. A hidden administrative account had deleted my report, applied my electronic signature, modified board materials, and somehow existed inside our corporate system without the CFO knowing it. Then Noah quietly said something that made the situation even worse. Mackenzie, that's not the only document this account touched. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, because my mind refused to stop organizing information. Over the years, I'd learned something about major operational failures. They rarely happened because of one catastrophic mistake. They happened because dozens of small decisions went unquestioned until they formed a chain no one could break. What Noah had handed me wasn't proof of a conspiracy. It was proof that someone had enough authority to quietly rewrite part of the company's history. I spread every document across my dining room table: the printed board packet, the digital version, the system logs, the login reports Noah had risked his career to bring me. I started building a timeline. Monday 8:12 a.m., board packet finalized by finance. Monday 8:27 a.m., board admin URS7 logged into the document management system. Monday 8:34 a.m., page 19 removed. Monday 8:36 a.m., electronic signature applied. Monday 8:41 a.m., revised packet uploaded. Monday 11:00 a.m., board meeting began. Monday afternoon. I was officially terminated. The timing wasn't accidental. Whoever had done this knew exactly when the board would receive its materials. I circled one detail with a red pen. The administrative account had never accessed the financial statements, only governance documents, board agendas, voting resolutions, executive employment records. It wasn't someone trying to hide accounting fraud. It was someone manipulating decisions. That distinction mattered. Early the next morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my father's name. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Dad? Mackenzie. His voice sounded older than it had only a week earlier. I heard you've been talking to people. I've answered questions. I wish you'd come by the house. There was a long pause. Please. I drove to my parents' home that afternoon. The house looked exactly as it always had. Perfect lawn, fresh flowers, my mother's wind chimes hanging near the porch. Everything appeared peaceful. Inside, nothing felt peaceful. My father sat in his favorite chair by the living room window. Since his stroke 18 months earlier, he moved more slowly, but his mind remained sharp. At least I had always believed so. He motioned for me to sit. I'm sorry about Monday. I waited. He continued, I know it was difficult. Difficult? Mackenzie, I built half that company, Dad. I know. I spent 14 years there. I know. I was escorted out by security. His shoulders lowered. I didn't want that. But you let it happen. Silence settled between us. Finally, he looked at me. Adrian told the board the company needed unified leadership. So you voted for my termination? I trusted your brother. There it was. Not anger, not betrayal, trust. The kind of trust parents sometimes give one child simply because they've stopped questioning him. I reached into my bag and removed the 2 versions of the board packet. I want you to look at something. He adjusted his reading glasses. At first, he didn't notice. Then I pointed to the page numbers. 18. He nodded. 20. He frowned. Where's 19? Exactly. His expression slowly changed. I don't remember seeing another page. You couldn't remember something you never received. He looked down again. I voted based on this packet. I know. He compared the documents several times. I would have asked questions. I believe you. His voice grew quieter. I didn't know. I believe that too. For the first time since my firing, I saw genuine uncertainty in my father's eyes. Not because I had convinced him Adrian was guilty, because he'd realized he might not have been given everything he needed before making one of the biggest decisions of his career. Before either of us could continue, the front door opened. My mother walked inside carrying grocery bags. Linda Gonzalez had always believed appearances mattered. She smiled automatically when she saw me. Then she noticed the papers spread across the coffee table. The smile disappeared. What is all this? I answered honestly. I'm showing Dad the documents the board didn't receive. She placed the groceries on the kitchen counter. Mackenzie? Her tone already told me where this conversation was going. This family has enough problems. This isn't about family. It is exactly about family. No. I kept my voice calm. It's about corporate governance. She shook her head. You sound like a lawyer. I sound like someone who was fired. You'll find another job. I stared at her. That's your answer. I don't want your father under more stress. I don't either. So stop this before it becomes public. There it was. Not concern over whether I had been treated fairly, concern over what other people might think. For years, my mother had believed protecting the family's reputation solved almost every problem. I no longer shared that belief. I didn't create this situation. No, but you can make it worse. I stood. What makes it worse is pretending nothing happened. She looked genuinely hurt. You've always been stubborn. And Adrian, he's carrying the entire company. So was I. She didn't answer, because she couldn't. My father quietly interrupted. Linda. She turned. I'd like to read the rest of these documents. She looked surprised. Richard rarely contradicted her directly. I think that's enough for today. It isn't enough for me. Another silence settled over the room. I gathered my papers. I'm leaving. My father stopped me. Mackenzie. I turned. If you find more evidence, he hesitated. Bring it to me first. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first crack in the certainty that had surrounded my firing. The next morning, Melissa Turner called. I need to see you. Is everything okay? No. Can you meet during lunch? We chose a small public park several miles from headquarters. Melissa arrived wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. She looked exhausted. You shouldn't have come, I said. I almost didn't. She handed me a sealed envelope. I made copies before they disappeared. Inside were personnel documents, termination authorization forms, approval routing sheets, electronic workflow records. At first glance, they looked routine. Then I noticed the creation dates. The termination paperwork had been generated 4 days before the board meeting. I looked up. That's impossible. Melissa nodded slowly. I know. The board hadn't voted yet. I know. Who ordered this? She swallowed. I received instructions from the CEO's office, directly from Adrian. He never signed anything himself. What exactly were you told? Prepare everything. For what reason? She looked away. I was told the board's decision was already certain. I looked back at the paperwork. Every approval field had been prepared in advance. Even the security escort schedule, the access badge deactivation, the return of property checklist. Someone had planned my departure before the directors had officially considered the motion. That wasn't just unfair. It suggested the board vote may have been treated as a formality rather than an actual decision. Melissa leaned closer. There's something else. What? The night before your termination? She lowered her voice. There was a meeting on the executive floor. I know. You know about it. I know it happened. You don't know who attended. I waited. It wasn't on anyone's calendar. No minutes. No assistants. No administrative staff. Just 6 people. Who? She hesitated. I only recognized 4. Adrian. She nodded. Yes. My father. No. I frowned. No. He wasn't invited. That answer hit me harder than I expected. The chairman emeritus hadn't been included. The COO hadn't been included. Yet a secret meeting had taken place immediately before the board voted. I looked at Melissa. Who else was there? She slowly took another folded sheet from her purse. I copied this too. It wasn't a meeting agenda. It was a temporary visitor access log. 2 names belonged to outside advisors. 1 belonged to Adrian. 1 belonged to Rachel Kim. The 5th was listed only by an internal administrative credential. Board Admin 07, and the 6th name made my stomach tighten. Harold Bennett, the independent board member I believed might become my strongest ally. I read Harold Bennett's name at least 5 times before I folded the visitor log. No, I said quietly. Melissa looked at me with sympathy. I had the same reaction. You're sure this isn't a mistake? I copied it directly from security before the temporary access records were archived. I stared across the park. Harold Bennett was the last person I expected to see on that list. He had spent nearly 3 decades as an audit partner before joining our board. During every meeting I'd ever attended, he challenged assumptions, questioned numbers, and insisted on documentation for even routine decisions. If someone had asked me which board member was least likely to participate in a secret meeting, I would have named Harold without hesitation. Did you actually see him? I asked. Melissa shook her head. No, I only saw the log. So we don't know whether he attended or whether someone simply used his credentials. Exactly. That distinction mattered. I thanked Melissa again before we went our separate ways. On the drive home, I resisted the temptation to call Harold immediately. If I'd learned anything over the previous 48 hours, it was this. Evidence deserved questions before accusations. By evening, my dining room looked less like a home and more like an investigation room. I pinned large sheets of paper to the wall. 1 listed people, another listed documents, a 3rd showed the timeline. Then I connected everything with colored markers. Blue for confirmed facts, yellow for unanswered questions, red for contradictions, the board packet, the missing page, the forged electronic signature, the hidden administrative account, the early termination paperwork, the secret meeting. One pattern became impossible to ignore. Every irregularity happened within the same 36-hour period. Not over months, not over years. Whoever coordinated this operation had worked quickly and with remarkable precision. Around 8 that evening, my father called. Mackenzie. Hi, Dad. I've been reading. The documents? Yes. He sounded unusually thoughtful. I found something that bothers me. I waited. The meeting agenda I received at home isn't the same version that's in your folder. My heart skipped. What do you mean? My copy has fewer revisions. Can you send me photographs? I already asked your mother to make copies. 20 minutes later, the images arrived. I enlarged them on my computer. The agenda looked nearly identical. Nearly. In the bottom corner of each page was a tiny revision code. My father's copy read Revision 4. The printed packet from my house read Revision 6. 2 revisions. within 24 hours, without the board being informed. I immediately added another note to my wall. How many different board packets existed? The next morning, I requested a meeting with Harold Bennett. I didn't tell him why. I simply asked whether he had time for coffee. He replied less than an hour later. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock, his office downtown. When I arrived, Harold greeted me exactly as he always had. Professional, reserved, impossible to read. "I'm sorry about what happened," he said. "I appreciate that." He gestured toward a chair. "I suspected this wasn't only a social visit." "It isn't." I handed him 2 board packets. He adjusted his glasses. For several minutes he said nothing. He compared page numbers, footnotes, revision dates. Finally, he leaned back. "These are different." "Yes." "Where did you get the printed version?" "It was accidentally placed in my files." He looked directly at me. "Does anyone know you have it?" "I don't think so." "Good." That answer surprised me. I had expected him to demand its immediate return. Instead, he seemed relieved that no one else knew. He continued reviewing the documents. Then he stopped at the electronic signature. "You didn't authorize this." "No." "I didn't think so. You believed me before I even answered." He nodded once. "Your signature habits are unusually consistent." I frowned. "What do you mean? You never approve documents before writing comments." He pointed toward the resolution. "This contains your approval." "But none of your observations?" I looked again. He was right. Every board recommendation I'd ever signed included margin comments, questions, suggestions, operational conditions. This document contained only my approval, nothing else. Harold smiled faintly. "Whoever copied your signature understood the software, but not you." It was the first encouraging thing anyone had said in days. He continued reading, then his expression changed. "This isn't good." "What?" He pointed to the voting agenda. "The motion to terminate your employment." "What about it?" "It appears under new business." "So?" He removed another document from his own briefcase. "This is the agenda I reviewed during the meeting." I compared them. At first, I couldn't see the difference. Then Harold placed both pages side by side. His copy showed the termination vote as item 7. The version in my possession listed it as item 9. "Why would that matter?" I asked. "Because item 8 is missing." I looked carefully. He was right. One agenda contained an additional discussion item. The other didn't. "What was item 8? Harold answered without hesitation. "Independent operational risk review." My own report, the discussion that should have taken place before anyone voted on the acquisition or my employment. I looked at him. "Did you discuss it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because item 8 disappeared before the meeting started." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Someone hadn't simply removed page 19. Someone had rewritten the meeting agenda itself. Harold slowly closed the folder. "Mackenzie." "Yes." "I need to tell you something." I braced myself. The visitor log Melissa gave me. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You've seen it?" "I have." "It lists your name." He sighed. "I expected that." "Were you at the meeting?" "No." He answered so quickly that I believed him immediately. "I was invited." "But—" "I refused." That wasn't the answer I expected. "You refused?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I was told it was an informal strategy discussion. And I don't attend unofficial executive meetings before board votes." He folded his hands. "I specifically told Adrian that if management wanted guidance, they should wait until the full board met." I felt both relieved and confused. "Then why does the visitor log show you—" "I signed in." "You did. I entered the building. What happened? I waited outside the executive conference room for less than 3 minutes. And then I realized the chairman wasn't there. My father. He nodded. I asked whether Richard was joining us. No one answered. What did you do? I left. I stared at him. You never entered the meeting, no. Can anyone confirm that security cameras? For the first time, we had identified evidence that didn't depend on memory. Video. Objective. Time-stamped. Harold reached into his briefcase one last time. I requested copies yesterday. My eyes widened. You already requested them. I did. And he slid a sealed envelope across the desk. The company's security director told me something very interesting. I looked at the envelope. What? Harold's voice became almost a whisper. The surveillance footage from that floor no longer exists. For a few seconds, I simply stared at Harold. The footage no longer exists? He nodded once. That's what security told me. I kept waiting for him to smile and say there had been a misunderstanding. He didn't. What reason did they give? They said the recordings were overwritten. How long does the company normally keep surveillance footage? 90 days. I already knew the answer. I had approved that retention policy myself 3 years earlier after consulting with our cybersecurity team. It had been less than 2 weeks since I was fired. There was no legitimate reason those recordings should have disappeared. They shouldn't have been deleted. I agree. Harold slid a folded piece of paper toward me. I asked security to put their explanation in writing. The memo was brief. It stated that video from the executive floor between 6:00 p.m. and 10:00 p.m. on the evening before the board meeting was unavailable due to an unexpected storage system malfunction. I looked up. Do you believe this? Harold answered carefully. I believe storage systems can fail. But I also know that our camera network automatically creates mirrored backups. I remembered. During one of our security upgrades, we'd installed redundant storage specifically to prevent losing critical footage. So if the primary system failed, the secondary system should still exist. Harold finished. I folded the memo and slipped it into my folder. Someone is making this investigation much harder than it should be. Harold didn't disagree. Instead, he asked a question that caught me off guard. Mackenzie, what outcome are you hoping for? I thought about it longer than he probably expected. Last week, I would have said I wanted my job back. And today, I want to know whether the board made a decision or whether someone made it for them. Harold gave a slow nod. That's the right question. The following afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Adrian. I almost ignored the call. Instead, I answered. Hello? His voice sounded surprisingly calm. We need to talk. I think we've already done enough talking. Not about this. I waited. I'd rather do it privately. I have nothing private to discuss. You might after you hear what I have to say. He suggested meeting at a restaurant halfway between our homes. Public, quiet, no reporters, no employees. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Not because I trusted him, because I wanted to hear what he believed I didn't already know. When I arrived, Adrian was already seated in a corner booth. He looked tired. Much more tired than the confident CEO who had terminated me in front of the executive team. As I sat down, he pushed a menu toward me. I already ordered coffee. I'm not here for dinner. I know. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he leaned forward. Mackenzie, I didn't want it to happen this way. I almost laughed. You had security escort me out. I know. You signed the termination paperwork. I know. You told everyone I no longer fit the company's future. His eyes dropped to the table. I did. So what exactly didn't you want? He rubbed his forehead. The public part. I stared at him. That's what you're apologizing for. No. He looked up again. I'm apologizing because you're my sister. Then maybe you shouldn't have treated me like a liability. His expression hardened for the first time. You left me no choice. There is always a choice. You would have stopped the acquisition. I would have delayed it. You would have killed it. If the numbers couldn't survive scrutiny, then yes. He leaned back. You never understood the pressure. I understood it perfectly. No, you didn't. His voice stayed controlled, but I could hear months of frustration underneath. Dad built an incredible company. I know. But the market changed. I know. We needed scale. I know. Without this acquisition, we'd lose investors. I answered quietly. And if the acquisition collapsed after closing, he didn't respond. Then we'd lose the company. He looked away. For the first time, I realized something important. Adrian wasn't motivated by greed alone. He genuinely believed he was saving the business. The tragedy was that somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that protecting the company justified manipulating the process. He finally spoke again. I can fix this. I folded my hands. How? He reached into his briefcase. A thick envelope landed gently on the table between us. I've prepared a separation agreement. I didn't touch it. Read it. Inside was a professionally drafted legal document, 23 pages. The first section offered me a financial settlement that made me blink. 3 years of salary, continued health benefits, accelerated retirement contributions, consulting compensation. It was objectively an extraordinary offer. Then I kept reading. In exchange, I would release every legal claim against the company, against the board, against every executive officer. I would agree never to challenge the validity of my termination, never to disclose internal governance issues, never to discuss board materials, never to cooperate voluntarily with any outside investigation without first notifying the company. I looked up. This is generous. It is. It's also expensive. So, companies don't pay this much unless they're buying certainty. His jaw tightened. They're buying peace. No. I closed the agreement. They're buying silence. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Adrian said quietly, Mackenzie, this can still end privately. I studied him carefully, not his words, his face, his hands, his breathing. He looked exhausted, not because he'd been caught, because he'd been carrying something alone for too long. I have one question. Ask. If I sign this, he nodded. Does the acquisition move forward without any more questions? His silence lasted barely 2 seconds, but it was enough. He hadn't answered with words. His face had already answered. I slid the agreement back across the table. I'm not signing. His shoulders sagged. I was hoping you wouldn't say that. I know. You have no idea what's at stake. I think I do. He stood. So this is where we are. No. I remained seated. This is where you brought us. He picked up his briefcase. As he turned to leave, he stopped. For what it's worth, I waited. I never hated you. Then he walked away. I sat there alone for several minutes before opening the agreement again. Rachel had asked me to forward anything Adrian offered. I photographed every page before placing it back into the envelope. One clause immediately caught my attention. Section 14, General Release and Ratification. The language seemed routine until the final sentence. By signing, I would acknowledge that all corporate actions relating to my separation were conducted in full compliance with applicable governance procedures. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I smiled for the first time in days. Adrian had unknowingly done something remarkable. If every governance procedure had truly been proper, that sentence was unnecessary. If they hadn't been proper, including that sentence suggested someone was worried they might later be challenged. Either way, the agreement itself recognized that governance procedures had become a central issue. I forwarded the document to Rachel. Less than 10 minutes later, she called. "Mackenzie, you saw it." "I did." "What do you think?" Her voice became unusually serious. "I think you need to come to Harold's office tomorrow morning." "Why?" "He received something in today's mail." "What kind of something?" There was a brief pause. "An anonymous package." "What was inside?" Rachel lowered her voice. "A flash drive. And we haven't opened it yet." "Why not?" "Because whoever sent it wrote one sentence on the envelope." I waited. "Deliver directly to the independent directors. Management must not see this first." I arrived at Harold Bennett's office 15 minutes early, not because I was impatient, because I barely slept after Rachel's call. An anonymous flash drive had appeared just as Adrian asked me to sign away every possible claim. The timing wasn't subtle. Either someone inside the company had decided to tell the truth, or someone was trying to manipulate us again. Harold greeted me at the door himself. Rachel was already inside. So was Noah Brooks. The atmosphere felt different from every meeting we'd had before. Nobody was guessing anymore. Everyone understood that whatever was on the flash drive could change the investigation. Harold placed the small evidence envelope in the center of the conference table. "I haven't connected it to anything." Rachel nodded. "Good." She removed a sealed laptop from a cabinet. "This computer has never been connected to the company network." I looked at her. "You came prepared." She gave me a tired smile. "I've spent 20 years telling executives not to plug unknown devices into their computers." Harold carefully opened the envelope. Inside was an ordinary black USB drive. No labels, no fingerprints that we could see. Only a folded note. Rachel unfolded it. The handwriting had been printed in block letters. "If the board wants the truth, compare what management presented with what management recorded." No signature. Nothing else. Rachel inserted the drive into the isolated laptop. Several folders appeared. Meeting audio board drafts, presentation revisions, email, exports. Noah quietly exhaled. "This isn't random." "No," Harold replied. "Whoever collected this understood exactly where to look." Rachel opened the audio folder first. One recording, 32 minutes long. The file creation date matched the evening before the board meeting. The same evening as the secret executive meeting. Nobody spoke while Rachel pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of chairs moving. Someone closed a conference room door. Papers shuffled. Then Adrian's voice filled the room. "We don't have much time," another man answered. It wasn't Noah. It wasn't my father. It sounded like one of the outside financial consultants hired for the acquisition. "We still have one obstacle." Adrian replied immediately. "Mackenzie." My stomach tightened. The recording continued. "She'll ask for another operational review." Someone else asked, "Can the board simply overrule her, Roy?" "They can," Adrian answered, "but not before she puts enough doubt into the room to delay everything." Another voice spoke. "What if she's removed afterward?" Adrian paused. "No." "Why not?" "Because if she's still COO during the meeting, she'll have access to every document." Another pause. Then came the sentence that silenced everyone in Harold's office. "We need her out before the acquisition reaches the final vote." Nobody around our conference table moved. Not Rachel, not Noah, not Harold, not me. The recording continued. One consultant sounded uneasy. The board won't like that. They won't have a reason not to, Adrian answered. The materials they'll receive will support the recommendation. I felt every muscle in my shoulders tighten. The next speaker asked quietly, "What about her report?" Adrian answered without hesitation, "It won't be part of the final package." Harold reached over and paused the recording. The room remained silent for nearly a full minute. Finally, Noah spoke. "I never knew." Rachel interrupted him gently. "It doesn't matter what we assumed before." She looked toward Harold. "What matters is what this recording actually proves." Harold nodded. "It proves management discussed removing material information before the board meeting." He looked at me. "It does not automatically prove the board acted improperly." His precision didn't frustrate me. It reassured me. He was still separating evidence from conclusions, exactly as he always had. Rachel resumed the recording. The discussion shifted toward timelines, legal review, investor presentations. Then another exchange caught my attention. One consultant asked, "Has Richard approved this?" Adrian answered, "He doesn't need every operational detail." The consultant responded, "That's not what I asked." Another long pause. Then Adrian finally said, "He trusts me." No one around our table spoke. That single sentence explained more than any accusation ever could. My father hadn't been part of the secret meeting. His trust had been used in his place. Rachel stopped the audio again. "This recording alone raises serious governance concerns." Harold nodded. "But let's continue." We opened the next folder, board drafts. Inside were multiple versions of the board packet, Revision 2, Revision 3, Revision 4, Revision 5, Revision 6. My eyes widened. So there really were 6 versions. Noah leaned closer. "Open Revision 5. Rachel did. Page 19 was still there. My operational risk report remained intact. She opened Revision 6. The report was gone. No one had to say anything. The difference was obvious. Harold quietly wrote something in his notebook. "Removal occurred between these 2 revisions." Rachel opened the document properties. The last editor wasn't identified by a person's name. Only the same account we'd already seen. Boardadmin 07. Noah shook his head. "I've searched every active employee. No one has that account." Harold looked at him. "Can temporary administrators exist?" "They can." "Who creates them?" "The IT infrastructure director." Rachel frowned. "Were they interviewed?" "No." "Why not?" "They weren't on our original witness list." Harold closed his notebook. "They are now." The final folder contained presentation revisions prepared for the board. One slide immediately caught my attention. The version shown to directors claimed Mercer Precision Components would require only $12 million in equipment modernization after acquisition. I opened an earlier draft. The same estimate had originally been $38 million. Someone had reduced the projected repair costs by $26 million. Noah looked genuinely stunned. "I've never seen this version." "Would finance normally approve a change this large?" I asked. "No." "Could someone make it without finance?" "Only if they bypassed us." Harold folded his hands. "The acquisition recommendation presented to directors may have relied on materially different assumptions. Again, not emotion, not speculation, facts supported by documents." Rachel leaned back in her chair. "I believe we've reached the point where the board needs to see all of this." Harold nodded slowly. "I agree." He looked directly at me. "Mackenzie." "Yes." "I'd like you to attend tomorrow's special board meeting." "I thought I wasn't permitted on company property." "You've been invited by the independent directors." He slid an official letter across the table. It requested my attendance as a fact witness. Not as an employee, not as an executive. simply as someone who possessed relevant evidence. For the first time since my termination, I wasn't returning because someone in my family wanted me there. I was returning because the board needed the truth. As we gathered our documents, Harold's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, then his expression changed. Rachel noticed immediately. "What is it?" Harold slowly lowered the phone. "The board secretary just informed me." He looked around the room before finishing the sentence. "Adrian has requested permission to address the board before anyone presents evidence." By the time I arrived at Gonzalez Industrial Systems the following morning, I had been away from the building for exactly 8 days. It felt much longer. The receptionist who had watched security escort me out couldn't quite meet my eyes. Neither could several employees walking through the lobby. Some offered small nods, others looked away. Nobody said anything. I didn't expect them to. Rumors travel quickly inside any company. The truth usually moves much more slowly. Harold met me near the elevators. "The independent directors voted to hear Adrian first," he said. I nodded. "I assumed they would. You don't seem surprised." "I'm not. If he believes he can explain everything before seeing the evidence, that's his choice." Harold studied me for a moment. "You're calmer than I expected. I spent years solving manufacturing crises. This isn't much different. Machines fail because people ignore warning signs," I said. "Organizations aren't all that different." He smiled faintly. "I hope the board appreciates that." The special meeting took place in the largest conference room at headquarters. This time the atmosphere couldn't have been more different from the meeting where I had been terminated. Every independent director was physically present. Our outside legal advisors were there. Rachel sat beside Harold instead of beside Adrian. That detail didn't go unnoticed. My father sat quietly near the center of the table. He looked exhausted. Adrian entered last. He acknowledged no one directly. Not me. Not Harold. Not even our father. He simply placed a thick binder on the table and remained standing. Harold opened the meeting. "This session has been called to review questions concerning governance procedures surrounding the proposed Mercer acquisition and Ms. Mackenzie Gonzalez's termination." He looked toward Adrian. "You requested the opportunity to speak first." Adrian nodded. "I did." He remained standing. "I understand why everyone in this room has concerns." His voice was steady. "I also understand how some of the documents you've recently received appear." He looked directly at me for the first time. "But appearances don't always explain context." Nobody interrupted. "For the last 18 months, he continued, our company has faced increasing competition from manufacturers twice our size." He displayed several market graphs. "Margins have narrowed. Customer expectations have changed. Our competitors have consolidated." Everything he said was true. No one challenged those facts. He changed slides. "The Mercer acquisition represented our best opportunity to remain competitive." Again. "True." Then he took a deep breath. "Mackenzie believed we should postpone the transaction." He looked toward me. "I believed postponement would destroy it." I met his eyes. "I did recommend delaying it." "I know." He turned back toward the board. "That's where this conflict began." For nearly 20 minutes, Adrian explained his reasoning. He never denied wanting the acquisition. He never denied believing I would stop it. Instead, he argued that delay itself would have caused investors to withdraw. "We weren't choosing between a perfect deal and an imperfect one," he said. "We were choosing between growth and decline." One director finally spoke. "That still doesn't explain altered board materials." Adrian paused. "No, it doesn't." The room became noticeably quieter. Then he surprised everyone. "I approved removing Mackenzie's operational report from the final packet." Even Harold looked up. Adrian continued before anyone could react. I believed the report was incomplete. I immediately spoke. It was complete. He turned toward me. It was incomplete from my perspective. Harold raised a hand. Mr. Gonzalez, the board isn't discussing differing opinions. We're discussing whether directors received all material information. Adrian nodded once. I understand. So answer the question. He inhaled slowly. Yes. I authorize that report being removed. No one spoke. The admission itself changed the room. Not because it proved every allegation, because the CEO had just confirmed that information presented to the board had been intentionally limited. Another director leaned forward. Did the board know material had been removed? No. Why not? Because I believed it would unnecessarily delay the acquisition. Richard closed his eyes. For several seconds, he didn't move. I had never seen my father look older. Harold remained composed. Did you inform the general counsel? Adrian glanced toward Rachel. No. Did you inform the chairman emeritus? No. Did you inform the independent directors? No. Each answer became shorter, each one heavier. Rachel finally spoke. Did you understand that withholding a material operational assessment could affect the validity of the board's decision? Adrian answered honestly. At the time. He stopped. Rachel waited. Finish your answer. At the time, I believed the company's survival justified the decision. No one accused him of lying. No one needed to. He had just explained his motivation himself. It wasn't personal hatred. It wasn't greed alone. It was certainty. The dangerous kind of certainty that convinces intelligent people they no longer need oversight. Harold looked toward me. Ms. Gonzalez. I stood. Unlike Adrian, I brought no presentation, only one folder. I don't disagree with my brother about everything. Several directors looked surprised. I also believed the company needed to grow. I also believed Mercer had strategic value. I placed my operational report on the table. My disagreement was never about growth. It was about verification. I walked slowly through the report. Deferred maintenance, inflated production forecasts, equipment nearing the end of its useful life, inventory assumptions requiring independent confirmation. I explained every recommendation in plain language. I never recommended abandoning negotiations. I recommended delaying final approval until these questions were answered. Harold interrupted. How long a delay? Approximately 60 days. Why 60? Because our engineering inspection teams estimated 6 to 8 weeks to complete physical verification. Another director asked, if your report had been presented, would directors have been able to evaluate these concerns before voting? Yes. Would additional work have been required? Yes. Could the acquisition still have proceeded afterward? Absolutely. The room became quiet again. For the first time, the discussion no longer centered on family conflict. It centered on governance. Rachel then introduced the evidence in sequence. The different board packet revisions, the missing page 19, the revised agenda, the premature termination paperwork, finally the audio recording. She didn't play all 32 minutes, only the relevant sections. When Adrian's recorded voice said, "We need her out before the acquisition reaches the final vote," no one around the table reacted dramatically. There were no gasps, no shouting, only silence. The kind of silence that exists when professionals recognize the weight of what they've just heard. My father slowly removed his glasses. He looked directly at Adrian. "Did you ever intend to tell this board what you had done?" Adrian looked at him. For a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he answered, "No." Richard lowered his head. "I trusted you. I know. I trusted you because you were my son. I know. and you used that trust to keep me uninformed." Adrian's shoulders dropped. "Yes." It was the first time he had answered without defending himself. Harold looked around the table. "I believe the directors have heard sufficient testimony." One by one, the independent directors nodded. Harold continued. "I am placing 2 motions before the board. The first is whether the termination of Ms. Mackenzie Gonzalez should be declared procedurally invalid. The second is whether an independent investigation should immediately begin regarding governance failures connected to the Mercer acquisition. Ballots were distributed. No discussion followed. Each director marked a vote in silence. The corporate secretary collected every ballot and carried them to the opposite end of the room for counting. No one spoke while she worked. The only sound came from paper sliding across the polished table. When she finished counting, she handed the results to Harold. He read them carefully, then looked up. "The first motion." He stopped. Before he could announce the result, someone knocked sharply on the conference room door. Rachel opened it. A courier stood outside holding a sealed overnight envelope addressed to the board of directors. Across the front in bold red letters were 5 handwritten words. Evidence submitted by federal auditors. No one in the room moved for several seconds. The words on the envelope seemed almost unreal. Evidence submitted by federal auditors. Harold looked at the courier. "Who requested this delivery?" "I don't know, sir. I was instructed to deliver it directly to the board of directors and obtain your signature." Harold signed electronically, thanked the courier, and closed the door. The room fell silent again. Rachel examined the sealed package before opening it. "The return address is from an outside law firm in Washington, D.C. She carefully broke the seal. Inside was a cover letter, several certified copies of correspondence, and a thick report. She skimmed the first page. Then she looked towards Harold. "This doesn't mean the company is under a federal investigation." I saw several people visibly relax. "It means," she continued, "Mercer Precision Components was already responding to inquiries from federal contract auditors regarding cost reporting on several government projects." Harold adjusted his glasses. "Before our proposed acquisition," Rachel nodded. "Months before." A heavy silence settled over the room. I looked at Adrian. His expression changed for the first time that morning. Confusion. Not fear. Confusion. Harold noticed it too. "Mr. Gonzalez." Adrian looked up. "Were you aware of these inquiries?" "No." Rachel slid the letter across the table. "The outside advisors representing Mercer disclosed them to their own counsel." She paused. "But they were never included in the acquisition materials presented to this board." Another independent director leaned forward. "Was that omission made by our management?" Rachel shook her head. "Based on what I'm reading, Mercer disclosed the inquiries to its legal representatives." She looked toward Adrian. "The more important question is whether anyone negotiating this acquisition ever asked for complete litigation and regulatory disclosures." Adrian slowly closed his eyes. "I assumed outside counsel had already reviewed everything," Rachel answered gently. "Assumption isn't due diligence." That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else said that morning, because it wasn't an accusation. It was a professional reality. Harold folded the report. "I think we've learned something important." Everyone looked toward him. "This case isn't only about one improperly handled termination." He tapped the documents lightly. "It's about a governance process that gradually stopped asking difficult questions." No one disagreed. The corporate secretary handed Harold the voting results. This time nothing interrupted him. He unfolded the paper. "The first motion." He looked around the room. "Declaring the termination of Ms. Mackenzie Gonzalez procedurally invalid." He paused briefly. "Passes unanimously." For just a moment I forgot to breathe. Not because I had won, because someone had finally acknowledged what had happened. Harold continued, "Effective immediately, all employment actions arising from that vote are declared void pending formal correction." No applause followed. That wasn't how boards operated. The decision was too serious for celebration. He read the second result. "The motion authorizing an independent governance investigation," another pause, "also passes unanimously." He continued reading. "The investigation will include document handling procedures, board communications executive authority, acquisition oversight, and administrative system access." Then he folded the paper. "As required by company bylaws, Mr. Adrian Gonzalez will be placed on administrative leave as Chief Executive Officer until the investigation concludes." My brother didn't argue. He didn't stand. He simply nodded once. "I understand." Our father looked at him for a long moment. "I wish you had trusted this board enough to let us make the decision honestly." Adrian answered quietly, "I thought I was protecting everything you built." Richard shook his head. "You were protecting your decision." Those words stayed with me. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. There is an important difference between protecting a company and protecting your own certainty. The meeting adjourned shortly after noon. People left quietly. No reporters waited outside. No dramatic confrontations happened in the hallway. Real corporate crises rarely look like television. Most end with people carrying folders instead of raising their voices. As I gathered my papers, Harold approached me. "The board would like to speak with you privately." I followed him back into the conference room. Only the independent directors remained. Harold spoke first. "Mackenzie, the board would like to invite you to resume your duties as Chief Operating Officer immediately." I had expected those words. What surprised me was how little excitement I felt. 8 days earlier, I would have accepted before anyone finished the sentence. Now, I wasn't so sure. One director smiled kindly. "You've earned this." "I appreciate that." Another director added, "The company needs stable leadership." "I agree." Harold noticed my hesitation. "You've already made a decision." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I have." He leaned back. "We're listening." I looked around the table. Every person there had treated me with respect that morning, so they deserved complete honesty. "I don't want my old job back." Several directors exchanged surprised glances. Harold remained expressionless. "Tell us why." "Because nothing has changed." One director frowned. "A great deal has changed." "Not enough." I looked at each of them before continuing. If I return as COO under the same reporting structure, then every future disagreement between the CEO and me becomes another family conflict. I paused. "I've already lived through that once." No one interrupted. I don't want future employees wondering whether decisions come from governance or family relationships. Harold slowly nodded. "So what do you propose?" I opened my notebook. "I propose separating oversight from operations." Several directors leaned forward. "I would accept a position on the board's Governance and Risk Committee." I continued. "I'll help redesign executive approval procedures. Independent document verification. Board information controls. Electronic authorization protocols. Whistleblower protections. Executive succession standards." I looked toward Harold. "I'd rather build a system where this can't happen again, then return to the office where it already did." The room remained quiet, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. Finally, Harold smiled. "I wondered whether you'd choose the harder path." I didn't realize it was the harder path. "It is." He folded his hands. "Because changing systems takes longer than replacing people." I smiled for the first time that day. "Operations always does." That evening, I visited my father. He was sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. He motioned toward the empty chair beside him. I heard about your decision. I figured you would. You aren't going back. No. He nodded slowly. I think you're right. I looked at him. I expected you to disagree. I would have. He smiled sadly. A few years ago. He took a long breath. I kept telling myself the company was still the family business. It is. No. He looked toward the old oak tree in the backyard. It became something larger a long time ago. He turned back to me. And I failed to recognize that. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he reached into the pocket of his sweater. He handed me a folded letter. What's this? My recommendation to the board. I unfolded it. It formally supported creating an independent governance committee and recommended me as its first chair. I looked up. You wrote this today? I should have written it years ago. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated. It was an email from Harold. The subject line contained only 6 words. The board accepted your proposal unanimously. 6 months later, I walked into Gonzalez Industrial Systems through the front entrance without carrying an employee badge. That still felt strange. For 14 years, I had entered the building as an employee. Now I entered as an independent director. There was no assigned office waiting for me, no executive assistant, no department reporting directly to me. Instead, I carried a slim notebook, a laptop, and a responsibility that was far more important than any title I had held before. The Board Governance and Risk Committee met once every month. At first, some executives quietly complained. Too many approvals, too much documentation, too many questions. I understood their frustration. I had worked in operations long enough to know that additional oversight could feel inconvenient. But inconvenience wasn't the enemy. Hidden decisions were. One of the first policies we approved required every board member to receive identical digital and printed materials through an independently verified distribution system. No executive, not even the CEO, could alter board packets after legal review without creating a permanent audit record visible to every director. Another policy prohibited any employment action involving an executive officer from being prepared before the board formally voted. Human Resources could draft templates. Nothing more. No termination letters, no security schedules, no access deactivation. Not until the vote actually occurred. Melissa Turner helped write that policy herself. I never want to be put in that position again, she told the committee. Neither did I. Noah Brooks led the redesign of our financial approval process. Every significant acquisition now required independent operational verification alongside financial due diligence. Neither report could be removed without unanimous approval from the governance committee. When Noah presented the new controls to the board, he smiled at me afterward. You know, he said, this would have saved us months of chaos. It would have saved us much more than that. He nodded. It would have saved trust. The independent investigation lasted nearly 4 months. Outside counsel interviewed dozens of employees. IT specialists reconstructed deleted system activity. Cybersecurity experts traced the mysterious Board Admin 07 account. In the end, the explanation proved surprisingly ordinary. The account had been created years earlier during a software migration. It was intended only for temporary administrative maintenance. When the migration finished, the account should have been permanently disabled. Instead, it remained active. Only 2 people knew it still existed: the former IT infrastructure director and Adrian. The investigators found no evidence that my electronic signature had been stolen by hacking. Instead, they discovered that administrative privileges had been misused to apply an existing corporate signature credential without my authorization. The report never accused Adrian of financial fraud. It never claimed he personally altered every document. What it concluded was both simpler and more painful. He had directed a process that bypassed established governance controls. He had allowed urgency to replace accountability, and he had failed to ensure the board received complete information before making critical decisions. Those findings alone were enough. 3 days after the final report was delivered, Adrian submitted his resignation as chief executive officer. He remained a shareholder. He remained my brother. But he no longer held executive authority. When he called to tell me his decision, his voice sounded different, lighter. I fought harder to keep that position than I ever should have. I know. I kept thinking stepping down meant I'd failed Dad. I looked out the window before answering. No, it means you finally accepted that leadership isn't ownership. He laughed quietly. I wish I'd understood that sooner. So do I. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful speeches, no promise that everything would go back to the way it had been. Some things shouldn't. A month later, my father invited Adrian and me to dinner. It was the first time the three of us had shared a meal alone since the board meeting. Conversation stayed cautious. We talked about my mother's new garden, about baseball, about my father's physical therapy. Eventually, he set down his fork. I owe both of you something. Neither Adrian nor I interrupted. I spent years believing that treating my children equally meant trusting you both without asking enough questions. He looked at Adrian. I trusted you because I thought confidence meant competence. Then he turned toward me. And I relied on you because I thought reliability meant you didn't need support. He smiled sadly. I was unfair to both of you. No one rushed to respond. Sometimes apologies deserve silence before forgiveness. Adrian finally spoke. I'm sorry. He wasn't looking at our father. He was looking at me. I kept telling myself I was protecting the company. I know. But I stopped listening to anyone who disagreed with me. He took a slow breath. Especially you. For the first time in months, I believed he wasn't trying to defend himself. He was simply telling the truth. I forgive you, I said. He looked relieved. Then I continued. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. He nodded immediately. It shouldn't. And it doesn't restore trust overnight. I know. That conversation ended without promises, without pretending the damage had disappeared. It ended with honesty. For our family, that was progress. Late one Friday afternoon, Harold stopped by my office at the board level. He placed a familiar document on my desk. I thought you should have the original. I looked down. It was the official board resolution. The same termination vote that had ended my career 6 months earlier now carried a large notation across the first page. Void. Superseded by Resolution 24-117. I ran my fingers gently across the paper. Not because I needed proof anymore, because I wanted to remember something. Justice didn't arrive the day the board reversed my termination. Justice began the moment someone insisted that evidence mattered more than authority. Harold smiled. You've been looking at that paper for almost a minute. I know. Planning to frame it? I laughed. No. What then? I folded the resolution carefully and placed it inside a drawer. I'm planning to leave it there. He looked curious. I don't need to see it every day. He nodded. I think that's healthy. It reminds me where I've been. But it doesn't need to tell me where I'm going. After Harold left, I walked through the executive floor one last time before heading home. Employees were finishing their week. Machines continued running. Meetings continued. Production schedules continued. The company no longer revolved around one person's confidence. It revolved around systems that required transparency, accountability, and shared responsibility. That was always the company my father believed he was building. Now it finally operated that way. As I stepped outside, the evening sun reflected off the polished steel letters mounted beside the entrance. Gonzalez Industrial Systems. For years, I had thought my greatest achievement would be becoming the company's most respected executive. I had been wrong. My greatest achievement was helping build a company where no executive, including me, would ever have enough unchecked power to quietly rewrite the truth again. When the people who hurt us are family, the deepest wound is often not the loss itself. It's realizing that love was used to silence questions, loyalty was mistaken for obedience, and keeping the peace became more important than telling the truth. If you've ever been taken for granted by people you loved, I hope this story reminds you that setting healthy boundaries is not an act of revenge. Boundaries don't exist to punish others. They exist to protect your integrity, your peace of mind, and your future. Forgiveness can be a beautiful choice, but forgiveness does not require restoring the same level of trust or access that once caused harm. Real healing begins when we stop trying to convince everyone that we deserved better. It begins when we know it ourselves and choose to act accordingly. Sometimes justice comes through courts, contracts, or company policies. Sometimes it comes from simply refusing to participate in unhealthy patterns any longer. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a relationship and protecting your own integrity? Share your experience in the comments, because someone else reading it may need that encouragement today. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, accountability, and hope, consider subscribing so you can join us for the next journey. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.